QUT Design Lab is proud to present Neuroinclusive Design Toolkit for Health Innovation, presented by Jim Hogan and Dr. Lutza Ireland.
So I'm Jim Hogan, and I came from a faraway land called California, and my pronouns are he, him, autistic, and I use autistic as pronoun because it's my neurological identity, and I want people to understand that I didn't catch autism like malaria walking through a jungle somewhere. I was born this way. So I am the principal innovation strategist for a little company called Google Cloud, and I am also the vice president of accessibility and technology for Google's Disability Alliance. So, and I am joined by my favorite collaborator, Dr. Lutza Ireland, who is going to introduce herself now, unless you want me to.
Please.
Dr. Lutza's she uses autistic, ADHD, she, her, for similar reasons as me. And she is a gifted social designer and a psychologist, and comes from an organization called Matrix DH, which means Design Plus Health. So, and we're going to move on for Dr. Lutza's first slide. Everybody hear me okay? Thumbs up? Okay, good. Thank you, Claire. I'm going to get to the slides. There you go.
Galang Nurundai, which means good day in Turrbal. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Turrbal and Yugara people. We recognize that these lands have always been places of teaching, research, and learning. And on this, I think it's probably very important to mention that neurodiversity is actually quite an emerging field. So there is a lot of room and space for teaching, learning, and research right here. So what you will hear today is really just a 101 introduction to some of the main neuroinclusive design guidelines that we have collected over the years. Now, neurodiversity is quite a hot topic at the moment, and it's something that both did and didn't exist for quite a while. From the medical model, you probably have heard about autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dysgraphia, and so on. This medical model says that these neurotypes are basically learning difficulties or neurological developmental disorders. And the medical model also says that disability is the result of biological abnormalities. So we need to look for cures and treatments in order to eradicate disability. And then we have the social model of disability, which is basically saying that disability is more an interaction between the environment that is inaccessible and a person who has accessibility needs. So based on the social model, if we give people accessibility, then there is no disability because they are able to fully utilize their abilities, skills, talents, and capabilities. But sometimes this model is a bit criticized to say that it still doesn't account for the individual experience and some of the difficulties and some of the extra pain and lived experience that people with disabilities live with. And the neurodiversity model somewhat goes one step further, saying that building on the social model, neurodiversity is a natural variation within how we are wired and how we process information. But it's not necessarily a disability. In fact, it can be a really strength-based add-on to intersectionality. So as much as we have differences within race, gender, ethnicity, religion, class, age, abilities, and so on, the way we are wired, process information, experience the world, the way we think, these are all natural differences. And that's something that we don't just have to accept, but we can actually celebrate it. And the reason for that is if you look at the graph on the right, I just fairly randomly picked some differences in human processing in terms of creativity, thinking speed, attention, and so on. And you see on the diagram, there is the middle section, which is typical. So typical experiencing is what most people do. And higher than typical and lower than typical is something that a segment of the population varies over as well. And if you could put it on the next slide, Jim, please. We talk a bit about the variations. So neurodiversity is literally every single person, because every single person has a different ability, a unique set of skills. And if you look at the image on the right, what you'll see is that for most people, the typical cognitive profile, meaning the most common cognitive profile, not the best cognitive profile, there are still highs and lows, strengths and challenges, but it is within the typical range. And when we have strengths and challenges that are distinct and significant compared to typical, that's when we call someone neurodistinct, because they have a distinct cognitive profile. And would you like to add something?
No, I was just going to say this all makes perfect sense to me. So. No, the only thing I wanted to add is that when we talk about neurodiversity, is not an othering activity. We don't talk about those neurodiverse people over there, because congratulations, you're all neurodiverse. So when we talk about people who are neurodistinct, they may have been born a certain way, or they may have a brain injury or some sort of traumatic event that has made them neurodistinct, meaning that they just perceive the world around them in a distinct manner. But congratulations, everyone is part of the neurodiversity world. So don't think nobody's special here. So.
And yeah, in fact, 20% is what we estimate the neurodistinct population to be. So that's why it's also very important that when we talk about neuroinclusion, we talk about a very significant amount of people who may have distinct needs, but Jim will talk a bit about why it's important to actually include for different neurological and cognitive profiles. And one of the reasons, as you were saying, is that diversity is a fact. So we are all different, we all have different makeups, but inclusion is a choice. So just because we say we are different and we should cater for it, that doesn't mean that inclusion truly has happened. And so when we were thinking about these different profiles, they look a bit like star constellations in the sky. And one of the ways of thinking about inclusion is to be like the night sky, that we don't want just one particular star to shine, we want all of them to shine as much as they can.
And regardless of what configuration those stars are in, when we start talking about the complexity of that, it very much starts emulating the human brain and how that works, and all of the ways that it can be wired together. So, next slide. Is this my slide? Yes.
It is, because I really liked how you talked about neuroinclusive health innovation. I asked you what neuroinclusive health innovation would be for you if it is successful, and I just loved your definition of it.
Right. The thing to remember is that we're talking about the health innovation, and the reason we're talking about neuroinclusive is that it is probably one of the ways we can get a great impact. But basically, when you're performing or delivering healthcare in that care continuum, you are basically dealing with individuals on the best day or the worst day of their lives, and so there is an emotional arc that's involved. And that's why I always stress the fact that what we're trying to do is deliver outcomes in the most comfortable and dignified way, because there's a lot of loss of dignity and a lot of emotional arc that takes place. And I had somebody tell me that when you're dealing with either welcoming a new family member or saying goodbye to an existing family member, healthcare is basically there's a range of that, and then there's everything that lines in the center. So that's what we talk about, this dignified way of delivering outcomes and doing those things that are over and above. And that's the thing that when you start talking about care continuum and how do we innovate in that area, and we'll talk about, you know, all the factors of that in a second. But when you look at what's good for the neurodistinct individuals, you're going to find something that's good for everybody. So that's why we talk about neuroinclusion, because it is what works for neurodistinct is going to work perfectly for everybody else. So is the cartoon coming up? Because I'm excited about the cartoon.
I think it's probably the cartoon. Yes.
This is your cartoon.
Yeah. Go for it.
I'm gonna do this one. So what the cartoon is depicting is that we have, you know, one student that needs to get into school who has to use the ramp, and when asked, can you please shovel the ramp, and the person who's shoveling basically states that I am going to shovel these stairs first for the rest of the children to get in, and the child comes back and says, but we can all use the ramp. So a very, very lovely cartoon to depict that, you know, what works for one person basically can work for everybody. And that is the true definition of build for everyone, you know, when you're talking about accessibility. So that ramp is actually probably a preferred way to get in, because lots of less stub toes and broken ankles. So everyone clear on the cartoon? Very, very good. Thanks for reading that, Joe. Yeah, I'm a joke maker. I'm jet lagged. Oh, it's a Rubik's Cube. And so, you know, people will ask me why do I carry around these Rubik's Cubes? And first of all, I'm autistic, so I fidget all the time, and it's perfectly socially acceptable to have a Rubik's Cube everywhere. So, but the thing about the Rubik's Cube, the way we're using this as a metaphor for this session, is that this thing has 42 quintillion combinations as a puzzle. So like neuroinclusion is a wicked problem, this is also a wicked problem. So when we're looking at it, though, you'll realize that there's only a few components to it. And basically the complexity and interconnectedness is what actually makes it very difficult. But we're gonna break this down into its subparts and show you how we tackle wicked problems. So it's all very exciting. After this, you'll all become cube solvers, because it's all, you know, all of the world's troubles. So have I covered this slide effectively?
I thought it was great. Yes.
Okay, then I look for validation. I'm a uncomfortable social human. So, and I believe this is you.
Thank you. Because we are talking about such a massive area here with being neuroinclusive and what neurodiversity is, we really wanted to be able to give just a few basic skills and a few basic knowledge points to start a conversation and start some critical thinking for your own practices. And one of the things about health innovation is often we think about technology-led innovations, new devices, new products, new services, which is all very true. Often they are on massive scales, needing huge investments. And one of the design-led health innovations that is one of my favorites in terms of neuroinclusion is actually the word neurodistinct, which was developed by one of our really good friends, Tim Goldstein, who is someone who thought that the original term which neurodiversity uses for people with distinct cognitive profiles is neurodivergent. And yeah, there are a number of reasons why we are not fans of it. But in terms of thinking about accessibility or wording, we know that about 60% of the population, 60 to 80% of the population has a reading level of grade 5 to 6. So having a word like neurodivergent, it's really inaccessible for reading, especially when we are referring to a group of people who are 80% dyslexic, which is the main feature of reading difficulties. So it's really not the most suitable word. And it was actually amazing to depict in academia a new term, but trickling down to everyday use so that people can feel that it's more dignified, it's more accessible. Neurodistinct has a much more friendly sound to it. So I'd like to encourage everyone to think about health innovation in small scale as well as large scale. Otherwise, it can get really overwhelming, just like the Rubik's Cubes. There are so many facets of health innovation that it can be very easy to get to the analysis paralysis. So having said that, one of the ways of looking at neurodiversity and a neurodistinct person is through as though we had three different bodies metaphorically. And if we go to the first body, we call it the physical body, which is basically our biological flesh and blood. Again, neurodiversity covers every single person. On this image, you can see two MRI scans. On the left, the brain scan belongs to Temple Grandin, who is an autistic scientist. And what you can see is that in her scan, there is a really increased activity in the visual thinking areas and decreased activity in the verbal skills compared to a non-autistic brain on the right. And the reason why it's really important to understand is because we do have some biological differences and we don't want to erase it, we don't want to negate it. What we are saying is that differences are not weaknesses. So somebody who may have lesser skills in verbal expressions, they don't have lesser skills altogether, and they definitely do not work less as a human being. They have strengths in other areas, for example, visual processing very often. So on the next slide, we will see some of the main differences, for example, in our sensory system. And there are the 5 basic senses, which most of you would be familiar with, which is sight, hearing, taste, touch, and smell. And if you have ever researched on design for neurodiversity, you can Google it anytime. You will find a lot of resources for architecture because they mostly work with these 5 basic senses and how to accommodate it within the built environment. And this is really important, but what I wanted to add on to that is there are 3 other senses that we need to think about. One of them is proprioception, which is our ability to feel where our body is in space. And Jim and I are both sitting down at the moment, which is really lucky because if you saw us walking at any point, we're bumping into furniture, we look like we are drunk most of the time. And we're not drunk most of the time, are we? No.
We not most of the time. We are basically a walking calamity together. So, but it is very, very true.
But what it essentially means is that people have different abilities in proprioception, being able to modulate body's movements and joints. And when proprioceptive difficulties arise, that can actually throw out the body and experiencing in fairly significant ways. Or if you think about it, somebody who has really high proprioception, Simone Biles, the athlete comes to mind who is also ADHD, that would be something that she is distinctly amazing at. And then interoception is our ability to read and understand our internal state. So that's when we understand our hunger cues, thirst cues, pain, heartbeat, and so on. And the reason why that's very important in health is because often when we go to the doctor, for instance, we need to report on how we feel. But if somebody has difficulties knowing how their body feels, that is something that can be very difficult to report on and very difficult to experience. And I have had many different experiences of, for example, breaking or fracturing bones and not feeling it, contacting quite contagious illnesses that I couldn't pick up on. So it can be very difficult to balance also the understanding that interoception can be very low for some individuals, or it can be very high for some individuals. So they may even feel some of the slightest changes in heart rate, some of the slightest changes in digestion, and those changes can be so overwhelming that it throws out their system completely. And then the vestibular sense is basically our sense of balance, which just comes with movement. Even if you think about going up in an elevator in a hospital, you may not think, but for some people, that might be something that renders them really fatigued for the next 10 minutes. And so they may need a seat or a recovery area straight afterwards. Now, how does that relate to health innovation, and what can we learn from that and the Rubik's Cube at the same time?
Is it on the next slide?
I hope so.
Oh, goody. And so when we talk about, anybody who talks about innovation, there is this a lot of talk about failure. And, you have to fail big, fail fast, fail often, fail. A lot of people say that failure is the currency of innovation. The reason that we're talking about neuroinclusivity is that belonging, that feeling that you get when you are in a neuroinclusive environment, that is basically the fuel of innovation. So when you start looking at, this Rubik's Cube, and I should have scrambled it, but this Rubik's Cube is the same as this Rubik's Cube. They have the same rules of the construct. And this rule is that these center pieces, they never change. I'm not going to solve it now, but the center pieces never change. So white is always going to be white in the center, and its polar opposite, yellow, is always going to be the polar opposite, and it's always going to be yellow in the center. And red is always going to be opposite orange, and green is always going to be opposite red. And the cool part is I just took the 42 quintillion things, but now I just told you that the centers never change. So that's going to cut that number down quite a bit. So basically, what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to understand that the reason why that is so difficult to innovate in healthcare is that healthcare has no appetite or budget for failure, because we simply can't get it wrong, because lives are in danger. We talk about dignity and other things, and all of the things we talked about. I can't down an operating room at 2 a.m. because I want to be bold with an innovation. So that's why when we start talking about healthcare, neuroinclusivity is something that we can add as an innovation that is going to have a dramatic impact on everybody. And we don't have to worry about, operating rooms going down and things like that. So.
Could you tell an example about implementing that journey guide at Kaiser Permanente?
Yeah, so it basically, when you're talking about, the things you can impact is you want to make a situation where you have all the touch points of your system of record connected together in a way that when somebody calls to get their appointment, for instance, that appointment system is totally interlinked to the next piece of technology. When they show up to get their to their appointment that day, they get an itinerary, so it looks like they're going on a trip. Their journey through the healthcare continuum that day. All the follow-up appointments are scheduled and show up on the sheet, and the prescriptions are right there, readily available. So I came from a organization that is very much like national healthcare, because it's the largest shared health system in the U.S. and by actually taking all the disparate technologies that existed, I put it into where I told you that the centers never change. What we did is we added a rigidity of that rule of the construct, was that we wanted to make sure that those underlying foundational systems never changed, that everything was connected together. But then we had to provide flexibility, which we're going to talk about soon, maybe even very soon.
We're going to talk about it very soon, but what I'd really like to emphasize as well is that when we think about this 360 experience, so being able to arrive somewhere, have an itinerary handed to us, it's not a luxury. For some people, that's plain accessibility. So imagine if your sensory system is so sensitive that even the very act of getting from your house to the healthcare appointment is something that already depleted 50% of your energy. What will be available for you? And health appointments are anxiety provoking for everyone. We never go to a specialist appointment because there is nothing wrong. There is already something that happened leading up to it that is anxiety provoking. And then these small acts of getting into elevators, getting into traffic, the lighting is really bright and the sound might be overwhelming. Having these anchoring points of being able to know where you're going, what's happening and when, that can be something that really decreases anxiety. And so these are some things that can be flexible and can be quite changeable as well. But still, as Jim was talking about it, when we talk about failure, it's still the quick and early. So let's test at the very early rapid prototyping part of it, because we can't afford to fail when everything rolls out quickly.
And you mentioned the appointing, just a personal story. In December of last year, which is a long time ago, I wrote to my primary care physician and I said, my birthday's come up in February and I want to buy myself a colonoscopy. So can I please get an appointment for that? And I'm still waiting, because even a high-risk individual like myself, who's well over the age of a colonoscopy, I know I look young and vibrant, but I'm actually old and tired. But the reality is that the healthcare system is sometimes so jacked up that you can't even get an appointment for a test that could very well become life-saving. And I talk about that all the time, because if you can't even get the basic, the basic part about getting an appointment for, or actually having a mechanism to get a test that's critically important, then you may want to go back to the drawing board and start working on that stuff. So there's a lot to innovate. Even the very low hanging fruit, like as simple as the first part of the care continuum, which is like that research and appointing stage and referral. So referral was put in the same day that I asked, but then they're just not happening. Just a perfect example. So I knew I wanted to come to Australia and say the word colonoscopy, so I'm done. So thanks for joining, everybody. And okay, moving on to the next slide.
Thank you. So the second lens is on our inner body, which is our invisible inner experiences, including thoughts, feelings, and urges. Urges are things that we want to do, but we may or may not end up acting on that. And the reason why it's important is because, as much as I talk about three different bodies, we can't actually separate them. They are so tightly interconnected that if you think about thoughts, for example, a lot of feelings that we describe as emotions are actually our brain's ability to interpret chemical changes and different changes in our physical body. So if you think about interoception, which is our ability to read internal signs. For example, 80% of autistic people have what we call alexithymia, which is difficulties or inability experiencing and naming emotions. It doesn't mean that 80% of autistics have no emotions. It means that it's difficult to label and put words into the experience. And if you go to the next slide, these are just some of the ways in which we differ, how we experience emotions, how we think. And some of the ways we think is also about our processing styles. And there are very different processing styles. There are more than this. I just collected these 5 because if you're in health innovation, if you're in design, I'm hoping that already the significance of co-design and bringing in actual stakeholders with lived experience into the design and innovation process is foundational, and it's not something that we need to argue about. But how do you engage people in a neuroinclusive way? One of the reasons why I often talk about processing styles is I often design different toolkits for engaging neurodistinct people. And when I was testing the first toolkit, I can't show it at the moment because it's got internal confidentiality for the client, but I had photorealistic, very colorful images because they provide very high visual stimulation. I had really clean graphical black and white images, which are high contrast and low detail because they hold attention and visually easier to process. And then I also had just simple words written on the list. And then I was asking feedback from participants when I was testing the toolkit. And one of the participants, when it came to me asking why she chose the words as opposed to some of the pictures, she said, I don't mean to be rude, but what the hell is a polar bear supposed to mean to me? And I find it so apt because often designers can get so excited about visual means and creativity that it's actually very easy to forget that not everyone is a visual thinker and not everyone is an abstract thinker. So as much as we want to spark creativity, sometimes creativity is sparked by logic and facts and figures and being very literal and not using idioms and figures of speeches. But the main processing styles that are important, for example, for stakeholder engagement, as well as just with the innovation, actually the day-to-day use of any innovative products or services, is visual processing is when people need colors and pictures for information uptake. They often say, let's see how it goes. Auditory processing is when people process information through the rhythm and sound of words. So you may hear people speak to themselves or say, let's hear it. They want to talk it through. Then we have hands-on processing styles, which is very touchy-feely. It's very tactile. So people may draw, doodle, or they are often people who learn by doing. So they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to read about it. They want to try it out in physical, tangible space. And then the last important thing about processing styles is that often co-design is very keen on design thinking workshops, co-design groups, focus groups, and so on. But not everybody is comfortable or is able to process information in social settings. So group activities can be very energizing for those people who have a social processing style. They want to discuss it, they want to bounce ideas off, they want to collaborate. But then other people are actually solitary learners, solitary processors, and they need self-reflection, they need their own space and time to be able to think things through on their own. And that's when you can think about having a choice in how you engage people, and other than social learning or social processing in groups, you can think about what individual activities might be something that also engages people on their own terms.
And that polar bear gets me every time. So
I know, it's a good one.
I just, you should.
Great comment.
I'm a little bit weepy right now because that polar bear is just really gets me.
Well, we can actually link that. We can do a follow-up on it because there's a toolkit where the polar bear is there. It was a different one, which I can provide for all of you to be able to use and have a look at it, because that's not copyrighted. Well, copyrighted for me, yeah.
Yeah, you get to see the polar bear. I'm so excited. So now we're talking about the balance, flexibility, and structure. So for everything that happens in the Rubik's Cube, those 42 quintillion combinations, what we have to remember is that if the centers never change, then that means that this one right here is always going to have to be white and green. So that's going to be an edge. So now, because that can never change, because it's always going to be white and green. But the way that I get there, because this is something I can scramble and move around, I can scramble my Rubik's Cube, and the white is never going to change, but I just moved that green one. So now what am I going to do? Well, that's why we talk about it being flexible, because those are the ones that we can work really, really hard, and with science and training, you can move that flexibility, or using flexibility back into that position. And we know that this white and green has to be in that spot. So now I've basically told you the 42 quintillion things. Now there's 2 things that you know about the cube that will never change. So I'm not supposed to talk about the other one yet, right?
No, but what I would like you to talk about is some examples of interactive and responsive design, because one of the reasons why we are using the Rubik's Cube is that Jim, who is an amazing speaker, as you guys can all hear him, and obviously he's in amazing positions. His career is super impressive in terms of health innovation, can actually be quite anxious about public speaking, especially at universities. So Rubik's Cubes is one of his special interests, which provides a vehicle for engagement even during this presentation. And that makes presenting something that's a lot more accessible. And
that's true. And I didn't mean to cut you off. So
no, what I wanted to say is that you are, Google is arguably one of the best companies in the world, and obviously you love it. We love it. You all have to love it.
And it's a verb. I've always wanted to work for a verb.
But as much as you are able to, with ease, operate in incredible multi-million, quintillion-dollar deals, you have a rule of, for example, no phone calls from healthcare providers.
Right. I have a rule that, at work, what's interesting is that it's not the world around me that needs work. I'm sorry. It's not me that needs work. It's the world around me that needs work, right? Because I was born like this. So what I do is I write a user guide, and when I went through the healthcare, I had some surgery, and basically the healthcare provider kept trying to call me to give me, schedule an appointment. And the problem is I spend like 10 hours a day on meetings, so I don't pause the cadence of somebody who has scheduled my time to take an unscheduled interaction, even if it's from healthcare. So I finally just went back and told my surgeon, Dr. Mark, I said, Dr. Mark, I don't take inbound phone calls, and you know that. And he's like, ran around and started yelling at everybody in the office. It's like, Jim Hogan does not take inbound phone calls. And they're all just running around going, "What, Dr. Mark, you're crazy. What do you mean he doesn't take inbound phone calls?" So it was just an example of, and at work, I write a user guide. Everybody at Google knows that I don't take inbound phone calls. I don't let people, schedule my time, without having a proper notice. You'll get an immediate rejection if you try to do that on my calendar, things like that. And I use that to set my own rigid rules of my own construct to make sure that everybody knows how to move the parts around to solve that Jim Hogan mystery. So.
And I think that's one of the very important things to think about with interactive and responsive design is you were talking about something even as simple as scheduling How are we enabling people to be able to use systems and services on their own terms in a processing style that actually suits them? And I'm autistic and ADHD, so I also don't have really significantly good auditory processing, which means that often when I go to the doctors, they tell me 15 things. I'm already overwhelmed by the bright lights. My mind wanders from one thing to the others. And by the time I finish the appointment, I will probably retain 2 things out of the 15 that was mentioned to me. Now, I'm not actually alone with this, but what might be an interactive and responsive design in that is a doctor being able to understand that sometimes writing things down for someone, and I'm not talking about I need an essay, but writing down keywords. So I often take my notepad for this very reason. But just think about what are the terms of interactions that we take for granted. So for example, oral communication in healthcare with doctors is something that we take for granted. But what if, thinking back the slide that you saw about the brain image, where somebody's verbal output is a lot more limited, or they might not speak at all, it doesn't mean that they shouldn't be engaging with healthcare unassisted. It means that we need to find more innovative way to enable people whose preferred style or style of communication is not speaking at all. I'm going to stop talking, but I thought it was important.
No, it's very important, because remember the fact that you may go to the doctor and not want any written information at all. You retain everything perfectly. You hear everything because, you know, that's the way that you process information. But if you get handed a sheet that has information written down, you may not find it very valuable, and it might just be something you say, okay, yeah, that's interesting. But when we talk about what works for neurodistinct individuals, works for everyone, is that you can throw away something that you don't need, but a neurodistinct person may need that information. I'm the same way when I'm going through, you know, and then all of a sudden it starts giving me instructions of what I'm supposed to do when I get home, and I'm just like, can you please write it down, you know? And you know, it's always very interesting to understand that just because you don't think it's important doesn't mean that somebody else doesn't think it's important. So, and that's what makes the lives better for everybody. So that's why when I stay at Marriott's, for instance, and I never, ever, ever in my life have ever called the Marriott. I don't like to call the hotel. And if I have to, it's something that is really, really tedious. Everything is, if I try to do something on the phone, I just can't stand those interactions. So I basically, you know, when I started using like chat feature, I use the chat feature every single time I'm coming to the hotel. I'm like, hey, I'm in the Uber, I'm on my way to you, because I'm basically checking with, they obviously want me to use this to check in, right? So, but now I'm like over communicating because I just love using the chat feature. So,
but I think that the way it relates to healthcare, and we can go to the next slide as well.
Oh, there's another slide?
Is that sometimes it's very easy to underestimate how important these different ways of communication and processing preferences are, because as much as you were saying that you don't like calling the Marriott, you still used to do it when you had to, because you need to go and travel and you don't want to sleep on the streets. But I think it's very easy to underestimate how many people, for example, would literally not make a health appointment because they don't want to or cannot make a phone call. So if the only way of making appointments is by phone, many people, and many of my clients in the past, would procrastinate from months to years sometimes to make health appointments that actually does have detrimental health consequences if they are not attended to. So it's really important to think about communication preferences, because sometimes they are preferences, but sometimes they are accessibility issues that make something inaccessible. And it's not a preference, it's a straightaway inaccessibility. So the last lens that we're going to use is the social body, which is basically the interface between the self and the world. This is what others are able to see. And often people say that 90% of communication happens through nonverbals. And that's a very neurotypical thing to say. Neurotypical, again, is the 80% of the population who has typical highs and lows in their processing. But when it comes to neurodistinct people, for everyone, to be fair, communication is influenced by many things, but the two that I picked up for neuroinclusion is people's natural wiring. So autistic people in particular tend to have quite flat facial expressions, which can seem serious, standoffish, bored, aloof, and so on. These are just some of the things that we hear. And some people have natural wiring, which makes them look quite animated, and we may have therefore a lot more warmth and interest conveyed. But it's very easy to confuse the two, because somebody may not have the natural body language to communicate how they actually feel. And so that can lead to what we call masking, which is acting and behaving and modulating our expressions and movements in a way that conveys our feelings and thoughts with related nonverbals in a way that people are typically reading it. And that can be very confusing, and that can be very, very tiring as well. So if we go to the next slide, one of the main reasons why this one is important to understand is because health innovation and healthcare is really around a lot of interconnected relationships and social reciprocity. So the caregiving relationship is quite complicated, and it's a really complex dynamic. And when we have a person, for example, who has really flat facial expressions, and their nonverbal communication can be, for example, arms folded, which we are told means that somebody is closed or unhappy. As a neurodistinct person, I'm often permanently cold. So I would often fold my arms because it's a way of warmth, but it's also a way of gathering some more proprioceptive input, which balances my nervous system. So often what people may think is uninterested or standoffish or aloofish is literally me trying to regulate my nervous system. And the way it's important in healthcare is that it can often lead to the double empathy problem. The double empathy problem is that neurotypical people often assume that, for example, autistic or other neurodistinct people have lack of empathy or lack of understanding because their body language and actions don't convey the type of response that someone would want to get. So for instance, if someone says, I've got a headache, and the other person says, well, how about you take some painkillers? That can sound like a really cold, uninterested response because it's very task focused. And often what people want to hear is that leaning in, oh no, you've got a sore head. Oh, that's no good. But that might not be natural for many people purely through their natural wiring. It doesn't mean that they care less. It means that the way they show their care is in a different diverse expression. And so the double empathy problem is important to understand, because if we zoom out of that, within the caregiving relationship, we often come against this problem again, that doctors don't understand why somebody is, for example, being difficult or resistant. I'm using air quotes, because somebody should have made that appointment and they haven't made it. They're resistant to treatment. They're not looking after themselves. How can we care for them if they can't care for themselves? It's something that's often a frustration with healthcare providers. And that's lack of empathy, because what they don't see is that somebody may literally be unable to make that phone call, has extreme difficulties with planning and organizations when it comes to making appointments, following up referrals, or they may even have forgotten that they were supposed to do it in the first place. On the other end of this spectrum is, because we are talking about double empathy here, is that often people with lived experience forget that there are some rigid structures within which healthcare practitioners need to operate. So if somebody doesn't make an appointment or doesn't turn up to their appointments, that is in fact very frustrating, and it does take away somebody else's appointment, for example. And the real issue with this is that we then become parts of these opposing sides, and we look for who's wrong and who's right and whose truth should be elevated and acted on. So let's hear a bit about that and how we can incorporate that into more neuroinclusive design.
Next slide. Oh, goody. And so what happens is that, this 42 quintillion combinations, I've already told you that the centers never move, and that means that this edge part never moves. And so, or the edge has to be this color. So this has to be white and green. Now the other part of the cube is basically the third part, which is this corner piece. Now this corner piece is a intersection between orange and green and white. And that corner piece will always have to be orange and green and white. And so I've basically broken down your 42 quintillion combinations to 3 things you need to know. So this is basically about, how do we synthesize these opposing views and priorities? When Dr. Lutza was talking about the headache empathy, I usually add the word pumpkin. So how does your headache feeling? Pumpkin to anybody. So because I have a hard time with my lack of affect, and sometimes people think I'm coming off very unemotional. So I will actually add a word or something. I have the same problem with my crossed arms, not because I'm cold, but because that's just something that I don't have the social cues. The reality is that there are societal norms that have been created that I guarantee you were not created by an autistic person. It basically says, if you don't look somebody in the eye, you're dishonest. If you cross your arms, you're being aloof. If you don't acknowledge or play back something. So basically, this whole lesson is that instead of doing an either or when you're looking at these situations, you can basically do an and, both. Maybe the person is cold and has a headache or something to that effect. So is that a good example for what you were talking about?
I think it's a great example. And do you have one that also synthesizes some different ways of accessing things?
And so, when you're looking at, these type of things with like using at the end both, a lot of times you're not supposed to use your own preconceived notion that this person is experiencing something that I've experienced before, and I'm going to come up with the same solution. So it basically demonstrates that lack of understanding, because you're basically using your own personal experience. So I don't know if I've answered that one correctly or not, but
no, I think it was a great answer. And one of the examples that I can think about with synthesizing opposing views and priorities is that looking at things like an act of translation. So it can be even like a short sharing at the beginning, that this appointment we only have 15 minutes, for example, from a medical doctor. So as much as I would like to hear about how XYZ is going, for example, if somebody's a verbal processor and would want to give you their life story and how their cat is to feel more at ease, 15 minutes is often not enough for it. But being able to just balance that a bit and say, we only have 15 minutes, so we're really going to have to focus on the 3 most important things. Let's establish an agenda for what these 3 most important things are. Then we can avoid that really disheartening appointment that often happens, that people go to their doctor, they have many things to talk about, they run out of time, they didn't get what they wanted, or they go to their appointment, their doctor just looks at the chart, says 15 things, but the person says, well, how can it be right? This doctor doesn't know me at all. I haven't told them anything about what's actually going on. Other ways of synthesizing this in appointments can be, for example, booking longer appointments. So if you know that you're a verbal processor, you want to talk about how you really are, how you're feeling, book a longer appointment. And again, instead of just picking up the phone, providing the ability for people to text, to book online, to email, and to do phone call are all ways of synthesizing the opposing side. We are not saying that speaking is better than texting. We are saying that that's equally valid, that somebody wants to speak and another person wants to chat.
Like when I get my dental appointment reminder and it comes to me as a text and it says, if you can't make your appointment, please call us. And I just, I've lost so many phones that way because I just throw the phone out. But anyway, I think we are going to the last 5 minutes. So
yeah. So
first, I'm going to check this chat because there's somebody blowing up that chat, and we got to go check it. I have no lack of affinity with text. Okay, comment. No, thank you for listening. I know it's hard to understand me because of my accent, so I appreciate you all hanging in there.
There's a question there.
Is there low-hanging fruit for health services to begin to shift practice? And right now, what we're trying to define is that low-hanging fruit, which is, what works for one group can work for everyone. So, and we're trying to apply that to when people are putting together, whatever your care continuum looks like. The low-hanging fruit is to understand that the world is made up of many different ways of thinking, and to be neuroinclusive in everything you're doing. And that is going to be, what I consider the low-hanging fruit. Make it easy to get an appointment, and because the systems that are there that exist, there's a technology part, but technology will never have the empathy that social design aspect has, which is what we're talking about with neuroinclusive design. So, technology is not very empathetic. It's ones and zeros and sometimes very crappy. So,
but I think in terms of low-hanging fruit, and I see a raised hand, so we'll get to that. For me, the lowest low-hanging fruit is starting on the small-scale change of what can you, as an individual and as a designer, change in the way you interact around health. And it might just be a person who has a cold. It might be your own healthcare provider, or it might be just you having a think about what are my communication preferences? What is my processing style? And even just actually collecting that and then thinking about what assumptions am I making on the back of this? What biases do these open me up to? And then think about, okay, this is my preferred style. I don't represent everyone. So how am I catering for in my designs or in my thinking for other people's processing styles? So I think it's sometimes easier to start with yourself, and then you can do that self-reflexive practice of what makes it difficult for me to change? What makes this experience frustrating for me? What would be my ideal outcome? And then work on that a bit. And Natalie, I see your, Natalia, sorry, your hand is raised.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. It was an honor to hear your experiences. Really, really And I just have a question. I am a researcher, and I am trying to co-design certain methodologies for my research participants that has many types of disabilities. And in trying to do so, I have encountered that, as you said, more of very often the techniques that you or the things that you develop for let's say neurodiverse people, it will fit to everyone. But I've seen that within these diversities, there is some conflicts. So for instance, what you said, for some contrasting colors could be good, but for others it could be too overstimulated. So I'm trying to navigate through these difference, how to create a tool, a research tool that can be respectful of all diversities of these sensorial, conditions.
Natalia, did you have a specific question? I'm just trying to make sure that I respond in the most useful way possible.
So my question is, how can you create or design something that could be respectful of all diversities, sensorial diversities, if there is a conflict between colors or perceptions, or did you understand me?
Yeah, I understand you. So, and that's really the holy grail of what we're looking to do, and the change that I want to see in the world. So, if you want to ping me on LinkedIn, we can talk further. Let's have discussion, because if you're a researcher, I have all kinds of things for you.
Yeah, I think that this was really like a one-on-one tasting session to some of the critical differences in neurological and cognitive experiencing. And I also saw, Della, that you were asking for resources for inclusion, neuroinclusion, including work. I think we can organize sending through some resources on the back of this that can provide more tangible guidelines, some of them which already exist. So I think, Natalia, you will find some of those guidelines useful in terms of toolkits. Rebecca?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, hello, thank you for your presentation. Can I ask a question about, I'm in the art faculty, and I'm working on projects in the area of art-allied healthcare. For example, dance for Parkinson's disease patients, dance for survivors of crime and abuse. And I've been always drawn to decentralization of healthcare. Could I ask whether decentralization of healthcare is a good pathway for inclusion design of healthcare innovation?
And I think it is, because when I was talking about that rigid, the rigid rules, where, and when you're talking about decentralization, what that does, it means that we can have a rigid rule for the central part, but the decentralization part is all of the different process and little innovations that people can put in that are interfacing with that center. So the healthcare delivery decentralized with a centralized set of rigid rules is what usually works best, because that way, because innovation is an act of causality, it's a study of causality. And what works sometimes across one thing can also be applied. So when we decentralize, we want to make sure that we can get an innovation back into the central fold. Very, very important to study causality and make that happen. So I don't know if I answered your question or not, but that's what that's what popped into my brain.
Yeah, and I'd like to build on that question, because using mental health as an example, given my background, often we talk about mental health literacy, which is at the moment massive in global government initiatives. because mental health literacy, for example, highlights the fact that 1 in 2 people in their lifetime will have a significant enough mental health condition to warrant a diagnosis. I don't want to pathologize. I think at these COVID pandemic times, depression and anxiety is so prevalent that it would be basically abnormal to not be impacted by what is happening in this world. So we are not talking about pathologizing mental health. What we are talking about is that if you think about the numbers, 1 in 2 is so staggering that there is literally no healthcare service that would be able to cater for all these health needs in terms of psychologists and social workers and so on. So the solution to that is not to create more psychologists and social workers. I mean, in some ways that's a necessity for many reasons. But in terms of decentralization, if we increase the community's mental health literacy, it means that people are able to have approaches which are really strengthened by their local knowledge, their local context, their lived experience, their cultural knowledges, which are directly relevant to themselves and their communities. So this is about peer support as well as self-management. Mental health literacy, or health literacy in many ways, is the ability to manage and keep good health in self and your significant others and your community in the basic sense. And then it can escalate if it warrants further levels. And that's why it's important when it needs to escalate and when it can be contained. But I think that just echoes what Jim was saying, is that as much as we can decentralize certain things, we need a basic knowledge of what are things that are best off treated and nurtured and healed and empowered in small, individual, community-driven, decentralized ways, and what are things that need a centralized, rigid, adherent, and very precise action that health professionals need to deliver. And I think we might do 2 more minutes and then.
Right, and we have, Lindy, your question, I think we should probably take it offline potentially, but great authors, hopefully too soon, number 2 soon, great book. So, but anyway, I'm giving you a writing contract. The second question about, so if we can take those 2 offline, through Shelley maybe, and then, Shelley's here, she gave me a nod. So, and I think that's it. If anybody else has any other questions or something that I missed.
I would like to answer that. What alternatives would we recommend to co-design workshops which are respectful of neurodistinct people who are not comfortable working in social contexts? So there, I'm just gonna give you a couple of low-hanging fruits for this one. One of them is look into individual ways of engaging people. I think often if you look at photo elicitation, journaling, a lot of tools that we can use in co-design workshops, people can actually use it individually. So if you think about a journey map, you don't need to be in a group to do a journey map. And really think about virtual ways of engagement as well. So Mural, for example, and Miro have often very useful digital tools for whiteboarding, collaging, being able to do visual as well as verbal and written means. So that's one of the things. You can do some of the group activities and make them individual, and you can look up, like literally look at individual stakeholder engagement activities, tools, resources. The second one is that I wouldn't discount groups completely, but one of the easiest things that I do when I engage neurodistinct groups, or just to be neuroinclusive, is every group activity starts with a silent 2 minutes where people work on the activity themselves. Otherwise, what often happens is that the loudest person in the group will set the tone for the group, and the dynamics start to consolidate very early on. So if you say, for example, with a mural board, everybody has unlimited Post-it notes, say, this is a question, this is the activity, always write it down so that it sticks in people's memory as well. And say, for the next 2 minutes, just use the stickers, write down your thoughts, always give people an option to interact in the chat, or have a facilitator that they can speak and interact with. So these are the more interactive, accessible, multiple ways of accessing groups. And then you can also say, if you don't wish to speak in the group, then put it on the Post-it and leave it there.
And I think that this is a question that Shelley pointed out. So is there any moves to make it more accessible for people to get diagnosed in the first place? And if you're talking about, for neurodistinctions, I know that it's a very arduous process here. So, but you would know more about this.
It's an arduous process everywhere at the moment, and the really short answer I would give to that is that from a neurodiversity perspective, remembering again, we talked about at the beginning that neurodiversity is a social movement. Within this social movement, we say that self-diagnosis is valid. And the reason we say self-diagnosis is valid is because of that very reason, that often people don't have the physical accessibility, many different ways of accessibility. I've only been diagnosed about 3 years ago, and I'm a psychologist, so that's a bit embarrassing with me and all my psychologist friends to not pick that one up. But I think that's a very realistic state of as much as we are talking about diagnosis being complicated, it's even more complicated as further down we go into intersectionality. So being female, being gender diverse, being from a different ethnic or racial group, age, and so on, these all really interfere with how difficult it is to get a diagnosis. And one of the ways that really stuck to me, it was a meme on Insta actually. Somebody was talking about how a lot of health professionals really reel against self-diagnosis. And this person was saying, if you're gay, you can self-diagnose that. Nobody has to go to a doctor to get a certificate of being gay. And in many ways, I really love how you talk about autistic being your neurological identity. I think going with Rebecca, what you were talking about with the decentralized methods, I think people need to be able to have more empowerment around being able to identify their own neurological identity. But of course, a diagnosis can help access to resources. So I'm not discounting that one either. And I'm going to stop talking now.
And thanks so much, everybody, for listening. I appreciate you. And thanks for coming out. And that's it. That's my close. That's my close.
Cool. Yes, thank you so much, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk about this. And Jim and I are both on LinkedIn, so please do get in touch. We do like to connect. I'm a lot slower than Jim, so you'll get something back from Jim. I'm like, LinkedIn, I should check it sometime. So see how we go. But
have you connected with Claire yet? No, I didn't connect with Claire yet. I've connected with Claire months ago, so that's everything. So yeah, that's how we are. So thank you very much. Enjoy your rest of your day. Thanks for having me on your island, and talk soon.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.